They laughed when Jake Rodriguez stepped up to the microphone at Jefferson High's talent show auditions, his worn-out Converse sneakers making that familiar squeak against the polished gymnasium floor. The same kid who once convinced the entire sophomore class that the cafeteria's mystery meat was actually a new species of fish was now standing center stage, and everyone expected another elaborate joke. But in 30 seconds, their laughter would turn to stunned silence, and Jake would prove that sometimes the most extraordinary gifts hide behind the most ordinary masks. Jake Rodriguez had been the unofficial comedian of Jefferson High School since his first day as a freshman. Now 17 and a senior, he was a guy everyone turned to when they needed a laugh. Whether it was perfectly mimicking Coach Henderson's pregame speeches or orchestrating harmless pranks that somehow always brought people together rather than apart, Jake had built his entire reputation on making others smile. It was his superpower, his way of navigating a world where being the funny guy meant never being invisible. But what his classmates didn't know was that Jake Rodriguez harbored a secret that burned in his chest like a flame he dared not let anyone see. Every day after school, when the yellow buses disappeared down Elmwood Avenue and the hallways fell silent, Jake would make the long walk home to his family's modest apartment above Martinez's corner store, where his real self came alive. There, in the cramped bedroom he shared with his younger brother, surrounded by faded posters and secondhand furniture, Jake would pick up his father's old guitar and sing with a voice that could stop time itself. The music had started when Jake was 9 years old, the year his father, Carlos Rodriguez, had been deployed overseas with the National Guard. Before leaving, Carlos had placed his treasured acoustic guitar in Jake's small hands, teaching him 3 simple chords and saying words that Jake would never forget. Carlos had told him that music was the language of the soul, that when words failed, melodies could carry the weight of everything a person couldn't say. Throughout that long year of deployment, Jake poured his loneliness, his fear, and his love into that guitar, developing a voice that seemed far too mature and powerful for his young body. When Carlos returned home, he was different. The war had taken something from him that Jake couldn't understand at 9 years old. His father, once vibrant and full of laughter, became quiet and distant. The guitar sat untouched in the corner as Carlos struggled with demons that no one in their small Illinois town seemed equipped to help him fight. Jake's mother, Maria Rodriguez, worked 3 jobs to support the family while also trying to help her husband heal. She cleaned offices before dawn, worked at the school cafeteria during the day, and stocked shelves at the grocery store most evenings. Jake watched his parents struggle, saw how his mother's smile became forced, noticed how his father sometimes stared at nothing for hours. Without anyone asking him to, Jake became the family's source of light. He learned to make his little brother Tommy laugh when their father had his bad days. He perfected the art of silly voices and funny faces to distract from the tension that sometimes filled their small apartment. And slowly, Jake began to believe that being funny wasn't just what he did. It was who he was supposed to be. At school, the class clown role served multiple purposes. It kept people at a comfortable distance, preventing them from getting close enough to see the cracks in his family facade. It made him popular without requiring vulnerability. And most importantly, it meant he never had to risk failing at something that mattered to him. Because deep down, Jake knew his voice was special. But he also knew that dreams like his didn't come true for kids from families like his. The bullying had started in 8th grade and followed him to Jefferson High. Kids like Tyler Morrison, whose family lived in the wealthy subdivision across town, made sure Jake understood the social hierarchy. Tyler and his friends would make comments about Jake's bargain store clothes, about how he always brought the same peanut butter sandwich for lunch, about how his parents couldn't afford to send him on a class trip to Washington, D.C. They'd laugh at Jake's jokes to his face, then mock him behind his back for trying so hard to make everyone like him. But Jake had learned to turn even the cruelest moments into comedy. When Tyler commented on his worn-out sneakers, Jake would launch into an elaborate story about how they were vintage collectibles. When someone noticed his lunch was the same every day, he'd create a fictional peanut butter sandwich rating system that had the whole cafeteria in stitches. It was exhausting, this constant performance, but it was also the only way Jake knew how to survive high school. The music remained his secret sanctuary. Late at night, when his family was asleep, Jake would sit by his bedroom window with his father's guitar and sing softly into the darkness. He'd learned hundreds of songs by ear, from classic rock ballads to contemporary hits, but it was when he sang the old songs his grandmother used to hum, the ones that carried stories of struggle and hope, that his voice truly came alive. There was something about those melodies that unlocked a part of Jake's soul that he showed to no one. His grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had been a singer in Mexico before immigrating to the United States with Jake's grandfather decades ago. Though she'd never pursued music professionally after arriving in America, Elena had never stopped singing. When Jake was younger, she would tell him stories about the power of music to heal hearts and change lives. She'd say that some people were born with voices that could touch the divine, but only if they had the courage to share their gift with the world. Elena had passed away when Jake was 14, but not before she'd heard him sing. On her deathbed, she'd gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered that he had been given something precious, something that wasn't meant to be hidden. She'd made him promise to never let fear silence the music in his heart. Jake had nodded and promised, but as the years passed, that promise became harder and harder to keep. Now, as a senior at Jefferson High, Jake was facing decisions about his future that terrified him. College applications were due, and while his grades were decent, his family couldn't afford tuition without significant financial aid. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had suggested community college as a practical option, and Jake had agreed because it seemed responsible. But late at night, when he held his father's guitar, Jake dreamed of music schools and stages and audiences who would understand the stories his voice could tell. The Jefferson High Talent Show had been announced in early March, with auditions scheduled for the last week of the month. Jake had seen the flyers posted around school and felt that familiar flutter of longing mixed with terror. Every year, he watched the auditions from the back of the gymnasium, studying performers with a mixture of admiration and envy. There were always a few genuinely talented students who impressed the judges, but there were also plenty of acts that fell flat, and Jake had seen how mercilessly the student body could mock those who failed publicly. The idea of auditioning had crossed Jake's mind countless times over the years, but he'd always dismissed it. What would people think if the class clown suddenly tried to be serious? What if his voice, which sounded so powerful in the privacy of his bedroom, fell flat under the harsh gymnasium lights? What if Tyler Morrison and his friends turned his most vulnerable moment into ammunition for even more cruel jokes? The risks felt enormous, and the potential for humiliation seemed guaranteed. But everything changed on a Tuesday in late March, during lunch period in Jefferson High's cafeteria. Jake was performing his usual routine, standing on a chair and doing his impression of their chemistry teacher, Mr. Brennan, trying to explain molecular structures to a room full of confused students. The crowd around him was laughing, phones were recording, and Jake was in his element, building to the climax of his bit with perfect timing. That's when Tyler Morrison stood up from his table across the cafeteria, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. Tyler announced loudly enough for half the room to hear that Jake was all talk, that behind all the jokes and funny voices, there was probably nothing real there at all. He said that Jake was just a one-trick pony, good for a few laughs but not much else. Then, with a smirk that Jake would remember for the rest of his life, Tyler issued a challenge that would change everything. Tyler dared Jake to audition for the talent show, but not with comedy. He said if Jake was really as entertaining as he pretended to be, he should try something that required actual talent, like singing. The cafeteria fell silent as Tyler continued, saying that anyone could make people laugh by acting like an idiot, but it took real skill to move people with music. He bet Jake wouldn't have the guts to get up there and be serious for once in his life. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Around him, curious faces waited to see how he'd respond to this very public challenge. Some students looked uncomfortable with Tyler's harsh tone, but others seemed intrigued by the possibility of seeing Jake step outside his comfort zone. Jake's first instinct was to deflect with humor, to turn Tyler's dare into another joke that would get everyone laughing again. But something in Tyler's smug expression, something in the way he dismissed Jake's worth so casually, sparked a flame of defiance that Jake hadn't felt in years. Without fully processing what he was doing, Jake heard himself accepting the dare. He said he'd audition for the talent show and he'd sing. The words left his mouth before his brain could stop them, and suddenly the entire cafeteria was buzzing with excitement and disbelief. Students were already pulling out their phones, no doubt texting friends who weren't there about this unexpected turn of events. Jake had just publicly committed to the thing he dreamed of and feared in equal measure. That night, Jake sat in his bedroom, guitar in his hands, trying to process what he'd done. The rational part of his mind was screaming that he made a terrible mistake, that he just handed Tyler Morrison and every other bully at Jefferson High the perfect opportunity to humiliate him. But there was another voice, quieter but more persistent, that whispered about his grandmother's deathbed promise and all those nights spent singing to the darkness. His father appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of the guitar. Carlos looked older than his 43 years, his hair now more gray than black, his eyes carrying a weariness that Jake recognized but couldn't fully understand. But when he saw Jake with a guitar, something flickered in Carlos's expression, a ghost of the man he'd been before the war. Carlos sat on the edge of Jake's bed and asked what song he was playing. It was an old ballad, one that Elena used to sing, and Jake played it softly while his father listened. When the last note faded, Carlos was quiet for a long moment. Then he told Jake something he'd never shared before. He said that during his worst moments overseas, when the fear and the noise and the chaos became too much to bear, he would remember Elena's voice singing that exact song. He said music had been his lifeline, his reminder that there was still beauty in the world worth fighting for. Carlos looked directly at Jake and said he'd heard him singing over the years, even when Jake thought no one was listening. He said Jake's voice reminded him of Elena's, not just in tone, but in the way it seemed to carry hope even in the saddest songs. Then Carlos asked Jake if he was planning to audition for the talent show, and Jake, surprised by his father's directness, admitted that he was scared but determined to try. What happened next surprised Jake even more. Carlos reached into his closet and pulled out a case Jake had never seen before. Inside was a beautiful acoustic guitar, much nicer than the worn instrument Jake had been using. Carlos explained that he bought it years ago, before his deployment, planning to upgrade his musical hobby when he returned. But when he came back different, unable to connect with music the way he once had, the guitar had remained unopened. He handed it to Jake and said it was time for it to fulfill its purpose. The 2 weeks between accepting Tyler's dare and the actual audition passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Jake practiced obsessively, choosing and re-choosing songs, working on his stage presence, and tried to imagine how he'd handle the moment when all eyes were on him. He told no one else about his plans, keeping the secret even from his closest friends. The anticipation was torture, but it was also exhilarating in a way Jake had never experienced. At school, word of Jake's upcoming audition had spread throughout Jefferson High. Some students seemed genuinely curious to see what he could do, while others openly speculated about whether he'd chicken out or turn the whole thing into another joke. Tyler Morrison made sure to remind Jake daily about their bet, always with that same condescending smirk that made Jake's determination burn brighter. The night before auditions, Jake barely slept. He ran through his chosen song dozens of times, a powerful ballad that showcased both his range and his ability to convey emotion. It was a risky choice, requiring him to be completely vulnerable in front of an audience that had only ever seen him as a source of entertainment. But it was also the song that felt most true to who Jake really was beneath all the masks he wore. Audition day arrived with the weight of inevitability. Jake walked through Jefferson High's hallways feeling like everyone was staring at him, which they probably were. By lunchtime, it seemed like half the school was planning to attend the auditions just to see if Jake Rodriguez, the class clown, would actually go through with his promise to sing. The gymnasium filled quickly that afternoon, with students claiming seats and pulling out phones to record what they expected to be either a spectacular triumph or an epic failure. The judges, 3 teachers, and 2 local musicians sat at a table near the front, clipboards ready. Behind the curtain that had been erected at one end of the gym, nervous performers waited their turn, running through last-minute preparations and trying to calm their nerves. Jake was scheduled to audition 15th out of 20 acts. He spent the waiting time in a haze of anxiety and determination, guitar case clutched in his sweaty palms, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. He watched other performers take the stage with varying degrees of success, but he barely registered their acts. His mind was focused entirely on the moment that was rapidly approaching, the moment when Jake Rodriguez would finally reveal who he really was. When his name was called, the gymnasium fell into an expectant hush. Jake walked across the polished floor, his new guitar case in hand, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Behind him, he could hear whispers and a few scattered chuckles. Students no doubt expecting him to break character at any moment and turn the whole thing into an elaborate prank. Jake reached the center of the makeshift stage and set down his case. As he opened it and lifted out his father's gift, the beautiful acoustic guitar catching the overhead lights, something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. This wasn't the setup for a joke. This was real. Jake adjusted the microphone to the proper height, checked his guitar's tuning with hands that were surprisingly steady, and looked out at an audience that had grown completely silent. In the front row, Tyler Morrison sat with his arms crossed, that familiar smirk still playing around his lips. But scattered throughout the bleachers, Jake could see faces that looked genuinely curious, even hopeful. Near the back, he spotted Mrs. Patterson, his guidance counselor, who had somehow heard about his audition and come to watch. And there, standing by the gymnasium side door as if ready to escape if things went badly, were his parents, Carlos and Maria Rodriguez, both of them looking nervous but proud. Jake positioned his fingers on guitar strings, took a deep breath that seemed to draw from the very depths of his soul, and began to play. The opening chord of his chosen song rang out clear and true, filling the large space with a richness that commanded attention. But it was when Jake opened his mouth and began to sing that the real magic happened. His voice, freed at last from years of hiding, soared through the gymnasium like a force of nature. Rich and powerful, tender and strong, it carried every emotion Jake had ever felt but never expressed. The song he'd chosen told the story of someone finding the courage to be authentic, to stop hiding behind facades and embrace their true self. And as Jake sang, it became clear to everyone listening that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The transformation was visible in real time. Students who had been expecting a punchline found themselves leaning forward, drawn in by the raw honesty of Jake's performance. Phone cameras that had been raised to capture a potential disaster now recorded something entirely different, a moment of genuine artistry that none of them had seen coming. Even Tyler Morrison's smirk had faded, replaced by an expression of shock that mirrored the faces around him. But Jake was no longer singing for Tyler, or for the judges, or even for the stunned audience. He was singing for his grandmother Elena, who had believed in the power of his voice before he'd even learned to believe in himself. He was singing for his father Carlos, who had found hope in music during his darkest moments. He was singing for his mother Maria, who worked 3 jobs and never complained. And finally, he was singing for himself, for the boy who had spent years hiding his light under a bushel of jokes and self-deprecation. As the song built to its climax, Jake's voice filled every corner of the gymnasium, rich and pure and absolutely undeniable. Students who had known him only as the class clown were discovering that the person they thought they knew had been just one facet of a much more complex and talented individual. Teachers who had seen Jake only as a disruption were realizing they completely misjudged one of their students. And Jake himself was experiencing the indescribable joy of finally being seen for who he truly was. The final note hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity before fading into silence. For a moment, the gymnasium was so quiet that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Then, starting with a single person in the back row, applause began to ripple through the audience. But this wasn't polite, obligatory clapping. This was the kind of ovation reserved for performances that touch people's souls, that remind them why music matters, why art exists, why human beings need to share their gift with the world. The applause grew and grew until it filled the entire space, accompanied by cheers and even a few tears from audience members who had been moved beyond words. Students were on their feet. Teachers were applauding enthusiastically, and even the usually reserved judges were nodding their approval. Jake stood center stage, guitar in his hands, hardly able to believe what had just happened. In the days that followed, everything changed for Jake Rodriguez. The video of his audition, recorded by dozens of phones and shared across social media platforms, went viral within hours. Comments poured in from strangers around the world, praising not just Jake's voice but his courage in revealing such a personal part of himself. Local news stations picked up the story, framing it as an inspiring tale of hidden talent and self-discovery. But more importantly than external recognition were the changes in Jake's daily life at Jefferson High. Students who had never spoken to him before approached him in hallways to tell him how his performance had moved them. Teachers began to see him in a completely different light, recognizing that beneath the class clown exterior was a serious artist with genuine depth. And Tyler Morrison, faced with the undeniable evidence of Jake's talent, had no choice but to acknowledge that he'd been wrong. The talent show itself, held 2 weeks after auditions, was almost anticlimactic. Jake performed the same song to an even more enthusiastic response, but by then the real victory had already been won. He had proven to himself and to everyone around him that he was more than just the sum of his jokes, more than just the role he'd been playing for so many years. College scholarship offers began arriving in Jake's mailbox, including several from prestigious music programs that had seen his viral audition video. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, worked with him to navigate the application process, helping him understand that his dreams of studying music weren't just fantasies, but achievable goals. For the first time in his life, Jake began to envision a future where his passion could become his career. His relationship with his parents deepened as well. Carlos, inspired by his son's courage, began picking up his own guitar again for the first time in years. Maria, who had always known there was something special about Jake's voice, finally felt free to encourage his musical ambitions without worrying about being impractical. The Rodriguez family, united by music and mutual support, grew stronger than they'd ever been. 6 months later, Jake Rodriguez stood on the stage of the State University's concert hall, performing at a scholarship competition that would determine his musical future. The audience was filled with strangers, music industry professionals, and other talented students from across the region. But in the front row sat Carlos and Maria Rodriguez, beaming with pride at their son, who had found the courage to share his gift with the world. As Jake began to sing that night, his voice even more powerful and confident than it had been in the Jefferson High gymnasium, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about his grandmother Elena's faith in his ability, his father's guitar that had become the instrument of his liberation, and his mother's unwavering support. He thought about Tyler Morrison's dare, what had seemed like an insult at the time, but had actually been the catalyst for the most important decision of his life. But mostly, Jake thought about all the other young people who might be hiding their own extraordinary gift behind masks of ordinariness, afraid to let the world see who they really were. His story had become bigger than just his own journey. It had become a reminder that authentic self-expression, though terrifying, was the only path to true fulfillment. The lesson of Jake Rodriguez's transformation wasn't just about hidden talent or the power of music, though both of those elements were important. It was about the courage required to drop the masks we wear, to stop performing the roles that others expect of us, and to risk being vulnerable enough to show the world our true selves. It was about understanding that our perceived weaknesses, our fears, and our secrets might actually be the source of our greatest strength. Sometimes the very thing we're most afraid to reveal about ourselves is exactly what the world needs to see. Sometimes the gift we've been hiding is the one that will not only transform our own lives, but inspire others to find the courage to embrace their own authenticity. And sometimes all it takes is one moment of bravery, one decision to stop hiding, to change everything. Jake Rodriguez learned that day in the Jefferson High gymnasium that being seen, truly seen for who we are, is worth every risk, every moment of fear, every possibility of failure. Because in the end, a life lived authentically, even if it's more challenging, is infinitely more meaningful than a life spent hiding behind comfortable facades. The boy who had once been known only as the class clown had become something far more important. He had become himself. And in doing so, he had given everyone around him permission to do the same.